My name is Barb Howe. I'm an instructor at the University of South Florida, and these videos are made for my class, which is a special topics political theory class called POT 4936, Democracy and Propaganda, although of course, anyone is welcome to use these videos. Hopefully you find them interesting. This video is about the origin of state propaganda. So what I mean by that is the origin of the idea of propaganda as something states do, as opposed to plants, species, or the Catholic Church, for example. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of the word propaganda, its origins in wartime, in the First World War, but also its origins in early 20th century idealism and progressivism. And then I will talk a little bit explicitly about the link between propaganda and ideology, and what some of the debates have been about the use of propaganda within democracies. So if that sounds good, let's jump right in. Okay, to begin, let me tell you two different stories about a particular day in history, November 5th, 1605. Now, the first story goes like this. On November 5th, 1605, nothing happened. That's the first story. Second story goes like this. On November 5th, 1605, the gunpowder plot was averted, a king was not assassinated, and he went on to have a very nice day and unite the two kingdoms of England and Scotland. Which of those stories do you think is most remembered? Both of them are true. But of course, the story that we most remember in the famous rhyming couplet, remember, remember the 5th of November, also in the famous Guy Fawkes, and the Guy Fawkes mask, which you would probably recognize. It's the one with the little mustache, pencil mustache, looks very devilish, comes from the second version of that story. So two stories, both of which are true, but they tell very different stories. One is literal truth, that nothing happened that day, which is true, but the other one helps an entire kingdom to imagine what it would be like if the king was assassinated. So that was significant. The people who planted the gunpowder were Catholic rebels. They wanted to blow up Parliament while the king was visiting because the king was Protestant. And he was also going to, of course, like as I said, unite the kingdoms that were previously separate into one. England and Scotland were to become one with the reign of King James I. So that's an illustration of how much narrative matters. Narrative is basically the definition, a key part of the definition of propaganda. So if we want to think about what propaganda is, I have a brief definition here written on the screen, that it is any narrative, doesn't have to be verbal. Often propaganda uses visual communication as well. So lots of signs and symbols, those are still part of propaganda. It's any narrative, because a narrative is anything that tells a story. Propaganda is any narrative or messaging intended to motivate the masses. That's the second key part. It's not intended towards an individual. It's intended towards a group of people, or the masses, towards a political goal. Now, that's probably the most important part of that definition. As you all know, propaganda uses emotional manipulation rather than reasoned debate. It's not a cooperative give and take type of thing. There's a power imbalance between the person promoting the propaganda and the target of the propaganda in that manipulation aspect. But the important key aspect of it is that it's done for a political purpose. Now, it doesn't have to be always to incite revolution. That would be called agitation propaganda. There's also the propaganda of integration, which is propaganda that integrates us into society around us. So that's kind of, I guess we could call it also a governing type of propaganda. So multiple different types of propaganda, but it's always political, a narrative that is directed towards the masses to achieve a political goal of some sort, even if that political goal is pretty passive, just to accept the ruling status quo. That is the definition of propaganda. So it can be covert or it can be overt, both of those. Covert is, of course, when it's not recognized or not explicitly labeled as propaganda. That's probably the one we most think of. Um, but it can also be overt, in which it is recognized as, this is an organ of propaganda. An example of that would be the Voice of America radio that the US started in the 1960s to broadcast into Eastern European countries, for example. That was an instrument of propaganda. The USSR had similar things. It had Cominform at the time, which was the same idea. It was to promote the Communist Party messaging in other parts of the world. So it can be covert or overt. It can also be disinformation, but it can also be true information. So both of those are legitimate. An example of propaganda that uses true information is that during the Cold War, of course, always going back to that, the US and the USSR, Russia planted stories in a third country that used true information about the United States and its treatment of people of color and lynchings, especially in the South, in order to further its political goals in this third country. So in that case, it was covert propaganda because it wasn't directly attributed to the Soviet Union, but it was done using entirely true information. So it did not use any kind of false information or disinfo at all. So propaganda can use both disinformation and true information. Also, it's important to remember that all nation states use propaganda. It's not something that only autocracies do. Democracies do it as well. And then finally, it is closely linked with the concept of ideology. I'll talk more about that in the next few slides. But that's basically, in a nutshell, what is propaganda. Okay, so the history of propaganda as being something that states do dates back to the First World War. As I said earlier, previously the Catholic Church set up its Congregatorio de Propaganda Fide, which was like a congregation to promote the Catholic faith as a response to the Reformation. So propaganda was associated with religions before then, and of course it was previously associated with things that plants and animals do. They can propagate, but this use of the word propaganda in relation to something that states do really begins around the First World War. The U.S. set up its Committee on Public Information in 1917, just before it entered the war. The U.K. had already set up its Parliamentary War Aims Committee, though, in 1914, when World War I first broke out. It was later consolidated into the Department of Information by 1917, and all of the other countries that were participants in the First World War did similar things. This was the very first time where governments were consolidating communications efforts into specific government agencies designed to deal with that sort of thing. Before that, there may have been previous kind of sub-departments within some areas, but really this is really the first time. This is the birth of the public relations industry. Before this time period, we didn't really have a concept of public relations, so it wasn't really thought of. Communications efforts, formal official communications efforts, weren't really thought of as a thing before about the first decades of the 20th century. So the expectation was, you can see because of this, was that after the war that these departments would be disbanded in the democratic countries, and they were. In the U.S. it was. I'm pretty sure the U.K. also, but they were set up again when World War II broke out. But the idea is that propaganda as something that states do was definitely seen as part of a country's war-making efforts. So, and even today, still later, it began to be considered as part of psyops, or psychological operations. And even today, now we still talk about hybrid war or information war. So this continuation of the origins of state propaganda in warfare is something that has strong roots in, the war-making activities of a state. But it also has origins in something that might be kind of surprising, and that's early 20th century idealism or progressivism. So that's what I'll tell you about in the next slide. So the other origin of state propaganda can be thought of as residing within early 20th century progressivism or idealism. So if you think about what was going on around the time that, states first began to do this thing called propaganda, we remember about muckraking journalists, for example, such as Upton Sinclair, writing about the exploitation in the meat packing industry in his book The Jungle. Ida Tarbell, and Ida, the other Ida, who wrote about lynchings. So those were all examples of muckraking journalists who were exposing injustices within society. There was this idea back then, that this phrase that Wilson invented, pitiless publicity, was something that would help governments root out corruption and exploitation. Pitiless publicity was what it was all about. This was the part of this idealism of how we go about creating a better world, a better society. If you've heard that phrase from Justice Brandeis, the sunlight is the best disinfectant. That's essentially the context that he's talking about. It's a call for more transparency in government relations. The full quote is, sunlight is the best disinfectant and electric light the most efficient policeman. So if people know what's going on in their society around them, that will prevent bad behavior. That's basically the idea. So that's in the U.S., the origins of the state propaganda in the U.S., but you can also see this idealism in the origins of state propaganda in the communist countries, such as the newly formed, at that time, Soviet Socialist Republic. So the Russian Revolution happens in 1917. There's brief civil war. By the 1920s, the USSR was founded. The Bolsheviks are in power. They had this problem in that Russia's, a very large country at the time, and their literacy rates were very low. They lagged behind other countries in their literacy rates. So what they did is they sent people out into the countryside to teach the peasants how to read, but also to tell them, to educate them about the founding ideology of the new ruling regime, which was Marxist-Leninism. There are also various things like agitprop trains, and these were trains that went around and they showed movies and things like that. And the whole idea is what they called this political education work. It's to educate the people in the ideology of the current ruling regime, which was the Bolsheviks at the time. So the other thing that happened is that the Communist Party in Russia wanted, of course, to promote communist revolution in other countries around the world, so they started this thing called Comintern. And that's what its goal was to help the communist revolution happen in other countries, such as, for example, in China. So it did. The founding of the Chinese Communist Party has its roots there. They got a lot of funding and training and military support from Russia to create the Chinese Communist Party. They had a split, however, and had their civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. And that goes on until the Chinese Communist Party wins in 1949. But because so much of their ideology was modeled after Marxist-Leninism, was modeled after the version in the Soviet Union, you have a lot of overlap of ideas between the two countries. So in China, they called it ideological work. Same idea as with the Soviet Union. It was to educate the peasantry in the founding ideology of the ruling regime. So both, in communist countries and in Western countries like the U.S., state propaganda, official state communications, is something that states do. It also has its origins in idealism, in ideas about how to make the world a better place, how to better govern a country, and how to promote peace and avoid war. That concept of public diplomacy. Wilson's concept of public diplomacy was intended to help countries avoid war. So it's a complicated history. It's not all bad. It has its roots also in idealism. So given that origin of state propaganda in the U.S. in World War I, there began, right from the beginning, a big debate, starting in about the 1920s, about whether propaganda was good for promoting democracy, like Edward Bernays argues, or whether it was detrimental to democracy, as the popular columnist Walter Cold War Lippmann, he coined that word, Cold War. He also coined the word stereotype, which you read in the readings assigned for this week. He argues that propaganda is detrimental to democracy, and various other political theorists end up agreeing with that position, that propaganda is undesirable. One thing is that everybody does agree on, however, is that it is pretty much here to stay. Modern nation, it may be good or it may be bad. Either way, modern nation states need to use propaganda. That seems to be the overwhelming consensus. In all of my studies and research on this issue, I have not come across anybody who, suggests that a modern nation state can get by without doing propaganda whatsoever. So that, before that makes you depressed, let me tell you a little bit more about the link between propaganda and ideology on the next slide. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? Basically, that propaganda is ideological communication. That is, it's communication to the masses for a political purpose. All right? It is inherently ideological because it has a particular political purpose, and that makes it very different from the pursuit of truth, such as we do or think about with philosophy. So another word for propaganda is actually political rhetoric. And that is what we're going to read when we get to Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, in a couple of weeks. There you have a conversation between Socrates, the philosopher, on one hand, and a famous rhetorician on the other hand. So if you think about rhetorician, just substitute, remembering that political rhetoric is just another word for propaganda. Both are doing the same things. They're not aimed at discovering any kind of truth. They're communication aimed at convincing or persuading the masses. So that's what we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But overall, that's a pretty good summary of the origins of propaganda as being something that states do in the 20th century and into the 21st. So hopefully that was helpful. See you in the next video.